Hi all, welcome to Physio Exam Buddy. This video is related to the connections of cerebellum. We can classify the connections under three headings, that is afferent connections, then the neuronal circuits within the cerebellum and efferent connections. Afferent connections. Afferent connections means the fibers are carried into the cerebellum, that is input going into the cerebellum. The main input fibers are mainly the climbing fibers as well as the mossy fibers. And both of them are excitatory. That is, they secrete the excitatory neurotransmitter, most probably glutamate. And the peculiarity of this climbing fiber as well as mossy fiber is that they usually send the collaterals to the deep nuclei, which will pass on to the cortex. So you can see here, this is the climbing fiber and this is the mossy fiber, and it is actually plus here. So it is both excitatory, that is, it is exciting the cell on which it projects. And it also sends the collaterals to the deep cerebellar nuclei, which is situated in the white matter of the cerebellum. We will study in detail about the climbing fiber. This climbing fiber usually arises from the inferior olivary nucleus, which is present in the medulla, and they form a tract which is known as the olivocerebellar tract. And you can see here that these climbing fibers from the inferior olivary nucleus, they project directly into the Purkinje cell. So this is the Purkinje cell which is situated in the Purkinje cell layer. And you can also see that it will give off some collaterals to the deep cerebellar nuclei also. So this climbing fiber, it forms a strong excitatory input into the Purkinje cell, which is lying in the Purkinje cell layer. And on excitation, it actually produces some complex spikes in the Purkinje cells, and the activity is increased when a new movement is learned. So this climbing fiber, they carry proprioceptive input from the whole body via the inferior olivary nucleus into the cerebellum. Next input or next afferent connection is via the mossy fiber. This also have a excitatory input, that is the neurotransmitter is an excitatory one. And the mossy fiber, it carry tracts like dorsospinocerebellar, ventral spinocerebellar, vestibulocerebellar, cuneo-cerebellar, tectocerebellar, pontocerebellar, rubrocerebellar as well as reticulocerebellar. That is, the mossy fibers provide direct proprioceptive input from all parts of the body, plus the input from the cerebral cortex via the pontine nuclei to the cerebellar cortex, forming the cortico-pontocerebellar tract. And these fibers, they end on the dendrites of the granule cells in complex synaptic groupings called glomeruli. Out of this, the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts, they carry the proprioceptive impulses from all parts of the body, whereas the proprioceptive impulses from the head and neck area, it is carried into the cerebellum by the cuneo-cerebellar tract. And the tectocerebellar tract carry the visual information from the superior colliculus and the auditory information from the inferior colliculus. Next is the pontocerebellar tract, coming from the cortex via the pons, and vestibulocerebellar tract gives the sensation of position of the body in space. So as already told, these mossy fibers, they end on the dendrites of the granule cells, and they form a complex synaptic groupings which is known as the glomeruli. And this glomeruli also contain inhibitory endings coming from the Golgi cells, which is also situated in the granular cell layer. So the primary afferent systems converge to form either mossy fiber or climbing fiber input into the cerebellum. So the olivocerebellar pathway usually projects to the cerebellar cortex via the climbing fibers, and the rest of these listed pathways, they project via the mossy fibers, and several other pathways also transmit the impulse from the nuclei in the brainstem to the cerebellar cortex as well as into the deep nuclei. And these additional pathways include a serotonergic input from the raphe nuclei to the granular and molecular layers, as well as a noradrenergic input from the locus coeruleus to all the three layers of the gray matter. And the afferent tract, that is the vestibulocerebellar tract, it transmits the vestibular impulses from the labyrinth directly and via the vestibular nuclei, whereas the dorsal spinocerebellar carry the proprioceptive as well as extroceptive impulses from the body. Ventral spinocerebellar carry the proprioceptive and extroceptive impulses from the body. Cuneo-cerebellar proprioceptive impulses from the head and neck area. Tectocerebellar, the auditory as well as visual impulses via the superior as well as via the inferior as well as superior colliculi respectively. And the pontocerebellar carry impulses from the motor and other parts of the cerebral cortex via the pontine nuclei. And olivocerebellar, that is via the climbing fibers, it carry the proprioceptive input from the whole body via relay in the inferior olivary nucleus. So please remember that the climbing fiber is the one which is carrying olivocerebellar tract, and it transmits the proprioceptive impulses from the whole body via relay in the inferior olivary nucleus, whereas rest of the tracts, they converge to form the mossy fiber input into the cerebellum. Next is about neuronal circuit within the cerebellum. So we have finished with the afferent connections, that is the informations are carried elsewhere from the body into the cerebellum. Now we are going to study about the neuronal circuit in the cerebellum. In the first video of the cerebellum, I have discussed the gray matter, white matter, and all the three layers in the gray matter and the constituents of the white matter. So how these cells, how these neurons are connected between different cell layers, that we will study in the neuronal circuit within the cerebellum. So first we will see the Purkinje cell. So we have already seen that the Purkinje cell is located in the Purkinje cell layer, and it is one of the biggest neurons in the body. And this Purkinje cells, it have an extensive dendritic arbors, that is extensive dendritic branches which extend throughout the molecular layer. And it got an axon, which is the only output from the cerebellar cortex, and this will pass into the deep cerebellar nuclei. And again you can see here that this output, it is actually inhibitory, that is by this negative sign, because the Purkinje cell, the output, the neurotransmitter is the GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, that is by the minus sign. So it will inhibit the deep cerebellar nuclei. Next is about the granular cell. You can see here that the granular cell, it receives the input from the mossy fibers, and the fibers from the granular cell, it is going and innervating the Purkinje cells. The cell bodies of these granule cells, they are located in the granular cell layer or the innermost cell layer of the gray matter of the cerebellum. And each granule cell will send an axon to the molecular layer, which is the outermost layer. And you can see here that the axon bifurcates to form a T. And the branches of the T are straight and it run along distances, and these branches, it is known as the parallel fibers. And the output of the granule cell is always excitatory, that is why the plus sign, that and this granule cell will excite the stellate cell, basket cell as well as the Golgi cell. So that is why all these fibers, that is from the granule cell, the fibers projecting into the basket cell, you can see here that it is excitatory, and again the parallel fiber going into the stellate cell, which is again located in the molecular cell layer, it is also excitatory, and again it also excites the Golgi cells. So here also all the fibers or all the output of the granule cell, it is always excitatory, because the neurotransmitter secreted from the axons of this granule cell is glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Next is about the basket cells. It is located in the molecular or the outermost layer, and you can see here it receives the input from the parallel fibers coming from the granule cells, and the output it projects to many Purkinje cells, and the output from the basket cell is again inhibitory because of the neurotransmitter GABA, so it will inhibit the Purkinje cells. Next cell is the stellate cell, again more superficial in location when compared to that of the basket cells, again in the molecular cell layer, and this one also secrete the inhibitory neurotransmitter, that is the GABA. This basket cell, stellate cell as well as the Golgi cell, these three are examples for inhibitory neurons because of the inhibitory neurotransmitter it will secrete. Next is about the Golgi cell. It is located in the granular cell layer, and you can see here that the dendrites is project into the molecular layer, and it receives the input from the parallel fibers, and the cell bodies it receive the input from the incoming mossy fiber as well as from the Purkinje cells, and the axons of this Golgi cell it project to the dendrites of the granule cells, and the output is basically inhibitory because the neurotransmitter is again GABA. So we have finished with the neuronal circuits in the cerebellum. Now we are moving on to the efferent connections of the cerebellum. The vestibulocerebellar portion of the cerebellum, we have studied that there are three functional divisions of the cerebellum, that is the vestibulocerebellum, spinocerebellum as well as the cerebrocerebellum or the neocerebellum. So this vestibulocerebellar output passes directly into the brainstem, whereas the rest of the cerebellar cortex, that is the spinocerebellum and the neocerebellar part, they project via the deep cerebellar nuclei into the brainstem. So this deep cerebellar nuclei forms the only output from the spinocerebellum as well as from the neocerebellum. From the medial portion of the spinocerebellum, that is from the vermis portion, the fibers project into the fastigial nuclei. You have studied there are 4 types of deep cerebellar nuclei in the cerebellum video number 1. So the medial portion of the spinocerebellum, that is the vermis, it will send the fibers which project into the fastigial nuclei, and from the fastigial nuclei the fibers project into the areas of the brainstem, particularly the vestibular nucleus as well as into the reticular formation. So you can see here that from the fastigial nucleus, the fibers are projecting into the vestibular nucleus, which is situated in the medulla. So in the brainstem, and they forms the fastigio-vestibular tract, and again from the spinocerebellum via fastigial nuclei it will also send the fibers into the reticular formation of the brainstem, forming the fastigio-reticular tract. Fibers from the adjacent hemispheric portion of the spinocerebellum, they project into the emboliform as well as the globus nuclei, and finally end in the red nucleus of the brain stem. Now about the efferent connections from the neocerebellum. So the fibers from the neocerebellum usually project via our dentate nucleus, and they will end either directly or indirectly into the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. So if the fibers end directly, then that type of pathway, it is known as the dendrothalamic pathway. And indirect pathways are through the red nucleus, that is the dendrothalamo-cortical pathway as well as the dendrorubral pathway. So this slide gives the very important one, that is it gives the concise picture of the connections of the cerebellum. So you can see here that these pathways usually enter the brainstem either through the superior cerebellar peduncle or middle cerebellar peduncle as well as through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So these are the afferent connections which passes through these peduncles, and these are the efferent connections which passes through these peduncles. So you can see here that the afferent connections which enter the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle is the ventral spinocerebellar, rubrocerebellar as well as ectocerebellar. And the afferent connections which enter the cerebellum through the middle cerebellar peduncle are the cortico-pontocerebellar tract. And the afferent connections entering through the inferior cerebellar peduncle is the dorsal spinocerebellar, cuneo-cerebellar, vestibulocerebellar, reticulocerebellar as well as the olivocerebellar tract. And the efferent connections that leave the cerebellum into the brainstem, that is fibers projecting from the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle into the brainstem are dendrothalamic, dendrorubral, dendrothalamo-cortical as well as cerebellotectal pathways. And through the middle cerebellar peduncle there is no efferent connections, and the efferent connections through the inferior cerebellar peduncle is the vestigio-reticular as well as the vestigio-vestibular pathway. So that is about the connections of the cerebellum. So usually a clinical scenario will be given where the diagnosis is a cerebellar lesion. So the most commonly asked sub-question for that clinical scenario essay type is the connections of the cerebellum. Thank you.